right, thank you so much for staying with the Monday Report. You're just in time for the town hall session. You can send in all your questions in regards to companies at Trevor Mbija at Citizen TV Kenya. Use the hashtag Monday Report. We're really talking about the beneficial ownership information and why this is important. There was a deadline for it in last year. It already lapsed. What are the consequences for that? But first, let me introduce my guest to you really fast, beginning from my left. Madam Joyce Koech, thank you so much for making time for us. She's the Registrar of Companies. Asante sana. Abrahams Biso is also here, Programs Manager, Transparency International. Asante sana for coming in.
Thank you.
And on my right is Malachi Adede, Founding Partner and CEO, Liroja Services. Thank you so much for making time. Madam Koech, I'll start with you on this one. What is the difference between company ownership and beneficial ownership?
Thank you, Trevor, for that question. So when you talk about company ownership and beneficial ownership, when you're registering a company, there are certain requirements which are required under the Companies Act in terms of you need to tell us who the shareholders of the company are, you need to tell us who the directors of the company are, and each one of them has their duties and obligations in the company. You'll find that the shareholders are the people who own the company. But when we start talking about beneficial owners, what we are looking at is who exactly controls this company. Is there a possibility that the people we are seeing who are directors and shareholders do not necessarily own this company? They do not control this company. Are there people who are masked behind them, who actually exercise the actual control, and actually they actually draw the benefits from this company? So the difference between company ownership and beneficial ownership is when you talk about beneficial ownership, you're looking for the real person behind who controls this company and who owns this company.
Okay.
Yes.
Abrams, why is this information important?
It is important because if you don't directly link a company to a specific person or an entity, then it even becomes something very strange per se. Assuming there is some sort of scandal that has happened and the company, a given company is linked to it. And if there is no individual linked to that company, it even becomes very hard for the prosecuting authority, investigating authority as well, to carry on with investigation. And at the same time, even take these people to court in sort of corruption-related case relating to that company per se. So it's very important.
Okay. Malachi, you are a CEO yourself and a founding partner. Where's the nexus between privacy and transparency? Because what I hear from them is that this information needs to be out there, but there's also the aspect where people are thinking, I don't want to give all that information out there.
So I think what we need to clarify is that if you own a company, that company is a separate legal person. It's very different from you. So you hear people say, I own this company, I own this company. But technically speaking, you can't own a person. A company is a person that has got its own rights and responsibilities. Now, when that company does business, you need to know who you are doing business with. So the fact that you are a shareholder, in effect, just gives you the right to own a stake within the company. Now, it is important because there are people who then hide behind the legal person to do acts that are not legal. So you use it for tender, you submitted 20 companies that have people you've fronted, but behind any benefit that is being derived from that tender is one person.
Yeah.
So you give varied, for example, you can tender for 10 million in one company and 3 million in another, so that when they compare, they give you a 3 million company. Whereas in between, there are a lot of people who have lost the opportunity to offer that service legitimately. So in a bid to cure corruption, to cure money laundering, to cure any acts that are done behind a company knowingly, it's then very important to address transparency, and at the same time, because the company is a legal person, providing information of shareholders and directors and beneficial owners then is not a breach of privacy per se.
Yeah. And Madam Koech, this information is on the CR12, right?
No.
But there are those who you believe are still behind.
So the information which are on the CR12, you'd find information on the name of the company, the company number, the unique identifier number. You'll find the list of directors and the list of shareholders. So when we talk about beneficial ownership, when you look at the criteria which has been set out in the regulations, it talks about a situation where you are exercising your control indirectly. So you can find that on the CR12, you find Trevor, but behind Trevor there is Malachi Adede, who actually is controlling this company indirectly. That's why this information is not, it's not really the information which is available on the CR12. But also there are situations where the people you see in the CR12s are the actual beneficial owners. So there are situations where you find there is no other person behind those particular people who you see on the beneficial owners.
It sounds to me like you are depending on goodwill for someone to reveal that. Because if, like you mentioned, if on the CR12 it's Trevor who appears, how do you know if someone else is behind me? I could say I'm the only one.
I wouldn't say you're depending on goodwill. The reason I say this is when you look at the Companies Act, it places an obligation on the company, that's the directors, to submit information to the Registrar of Companies. In a situation where you submit misleading information, then it creates an offense. Say that if today you submitted information which you know for a fact that it's misleading information, if there is a crime, then certainly you're able to tie in the dots and be able to find out that indeed this is not the beneficial owner. Because when you look at the nature of the investigations that would be done by competent authorities, they're able to really look who exactly is benefiting from this particular transaction. So it's not a question of goodwill, because there are obligations which are placed on you as a director in a company, and the moment you do that knowingly, then certainly it's an offense.
Abrams, is this where the silver bullet to fighting graft truly lies? Because we've seen this situation in different circumstances. We've seen this in NYS, we've seen this in several other companies where some people are mentioned, but there's a general belief that this could not be the owners of this kind of transaction.
Trevor, it is to some large extent. This is where the fight against graft, but it's not per se the general graft we are talking about. Talk about anti-money laundering, talk about illicit financial flows, terrorism financing. These are some of the things that we say, if there is beneficial ownership transparency and it is implemented to the latter, then these things will come to the light and we know who are the real owners, who are the beneficiaries of these transactions behind these companies within our society. And then when we have this information out there as transparent or open to perhaps the agencies that are supposed to follow through these corruption cases, then it will be easier for them now to do the investigations, to do the prosecutions, and we'll see some kind of the fight against graft moving forward. Perhaps if we have this information in open.
Okay. Yes. Malachi, there was a deadline that was given, 31st of July 2021, for all companies to comply with giving that information. We'll find out from Registrar how many have actually done it. But are there some policy gaps that you see when it comes to implementing this particular move in regulation?
So in the last 2 to 3 years, the company's registry has moved from analog to digital. In the sense that initially we would go to the registry with files of physical papers to file. Now they've moved from receiving manual filings to all filings being done on the eCitizen platform. Now the change from manual filing to digital filing caught a lot of companies unawares, especially those companies that did not meticulously keep their records over time. Now, you have a company that was registered in the 70s, in the 80s, in the early 90s, that now you are being told these were the directors, but the people who are directors today are not the people we have on record. Now, the directors currently have no idea where the old directors have gone or whether they're alive or not. Now, reconciling old records with new records is what now is being called linker business. Now, in the linker business process, if a company was not meticulously keeping its records, it becomes a very difficult process to reconcile what is at the registry and what the company has currently. But processes are being enhanced to ensure that the gaps are addressed and companies are all onboarded on the system. So there is a technical challenge among practitioners in collating records and actually moving from the manual way of doing things to the online process. Now, when you combine the issue of records and the issue of technologies, you find that a lot of practitioners, lawyers, and company secretaries. I happen to be a council member at the Institute of Certified Secretaries, and when you deal with more senior members who all their life they've been doing things manually, now you require them to transition to a digital platform. There's a technical challenge for those kind of practitioners, and we are finding maybe it's a blessing in disguise because the younger practitioners now are able to grab a little bit of business for themselves. But coupled with the lack of records and the technology issues, because once the registrar has automated a process and they want you to give an ID number of a director who left the country 20 years ago, you are stuck. So there are solutions that are being developed to help such companies. Even though those directors cannot be traced, the registrar is able to entertain discussions with that company to help them to be onboarded.
Madam Koech, how are you dealing with those gaps that Dede is talking about, the technical challenge during the transition period?
Indeed, Trevor, I would say the transition process has been quite a challenge. The reason I would say this is we're talking about entities registered as way back as 1909. And you're asking this person to transition their information to our e-platform. You find that most of them, they do not have that information. And certainly, we would not transition a record which is not inconsistent. So what we've always done to facilitate our users, the practitioners, our stakeholders, we have continuous stakeholder engagements. We engage very actively with ICS, with LSK, so that we are able to journey together, so that they are able, whatever the gaps, whatever the issues, we are able to together come up with solutions which would be responsive to their needs. However, of course, there is also the challenge with most Kenyans not even being aware that there is, there is a transition process which is happening, because this is something which we began in October 2017, the transitioning of all entities which were registered to the e-platform. But I would tell you, for people who, for one reason or another, they've not required a CR12, they are not even aware that there is a transition process which is happening. Somebody comes and you ask them, you've not filed your annual returns, and they bring you KRA returns. It tells you that there is a big challenge as far as people knowing even the compliance obligations which are under the Companies Act. So there is the need also for a lot of awareness campaigns to be done, because there are many business owners who are not aware that there is these reforms which are happening. So some of the things that we are doing certainly is continuous engagement with our stakeholders, awareness campaigns, so that people are aware of the activities that we are undertaking at the registry.
I see a lot of questions coming through here, but we have about 600,000 companies in this country?
That's private companies.
Private companies.
Yes.
How many of them have disclosed the true beneficial owners?
So what I would want to say is this. We began this journey in October 2020. So come October last year, we done 1 year. By December, we had almost 33% companies, 33% having complied. That tells you that we have almost 67% who've not complied. And I would want to tie some of the issues which are affecting compliance, what Malachi talked about. If you've not transition to the e-platform, you're not able to submit this information, because remember, it's an e-register. First of all, you need to be on the e-platform before you can be able to submit your beneficial ownership information. So the first thing that needs to happen is more people need to transition their entities into the e-platform for them to be able to submit their beneficial ownership information. So some of the things we are doing, as I've pointed out, is more awareness campaigns for them to know that we have a service. It's a free service. And the benefits of transitioning your company or your business into the e-platform. One, you're able to access our services remotely. The other thing is you apply for your CR12 and you obtain it instantaneously.
Yeah.
It's no longer an issue of waiting weeks. You need to get a broker to do a follow-up for you. You pay it here, you get it instantly.
Yeah.
So in terms of the benefits, really, it cannot be overemphasized. Yeah.
But the business registration service issued a deadline for 31st of July last year. So what happens to those who have not complied?
Trevor, what I would say is the moment the regulations were gazetted, in terms of the full effect of the law, as in the law took full effect, in the sense of non-compliance is not, it's not an excuse. You see that? But what we are doing is to be able to support our stakeholders to comply, by putting in place proper infrastructure. I remember when we issued a deadline, we had an influx of applications. That was the point when all Kenyans were seeking to even onboard their entities into the e-platform. We saw numbers which we've never seen since the inception of the service. And what we've done as a service is to have additional capacity so that we are able to address these applications as they come in, so that we're just able to support you in terms of you being able to comply.
So have you extended this then, deadline?
We've not extended, and as I indicated, the moment the regulations were gazetted, it took full effect.
Okay, so someone who's listening to you right now and is wondering, where do I even start? Do they come to the offices, or what do they do?
What they need to do, if you've already linked your company on eCitizen, you just visit our website. You'll be able to find manuals which would be able to guide you. It's a simple process. You need to comply and submit your beneficial ownership information. If you're somebody who owns a company and you do not even know that there is a transitioning into the e-platform, you're not even aware that there is submission of beneficial ownership information, then still in our website you'll find information on how to transition your company into the e-platform. You'll find a manual on link a business. You'll also find a manual on submission of beneficial ownership information. And of course, if someone, for one reason or another, is experiencing any challenges, then they should be able to contact our offices, because we'll be able to give them the support for them to be able to do that.
Abrams, what do you see as the gap in this whole conversation? Because there was a deadline, out of 600,000, only about 33% have done it. There seems to be a bit of a challenge here.
Trevor, there seems to be a bit of challenge there, but I wouldn't want to delve into that, perhaps because they understand better why they still have that 33% compliance. But for me, what I would see in this beneficial ownership disclosure, there are a number of gaps that I feel if the BRS could address, then perhaps we would be talking about beneficial ownership transparency and in the fight against corruption per se. One is I'm looking into the act itself. There are foreign companies per se who are not supposed to comply. They are not supposed to comply on this disclosure just because they are registered based on the Companies Act in Kenya, but because by virtue of being foreign companies, then they are not able to disclose or to give that information on their beneficial ownership. Number two, I'm looking at trusts. There are trusts. We need to look into amending the Trust Act so that we have some of these trusts coming into play and also disclosing the beneficiaries of the companies or the trusts they are looking into. And then the other thing is LLPs, the limited liabilities partnerships, that is like law firms. So we need to look into, again, into the Act, we need to amend as well, and so that we have this PO disclosure coming into play. And for record, Trevor, you know what's happening now. There is a case in court, the Proceeds of Crime and Anti-Money Laundering Act, which was ascended to this year, I think early this year, by the President. And you know, LSK have gone to court to challenge. Perhaps we cannot talk about that. But this is where we're talking about, if we have this amendment taking put in place, and then we have the LLPs also having disclosing some of these, the beneficial ownership, then it will be a great thing that will help us perhaps to make another milestone in terms of having beneficial ownership transparency as a country.
Okay. Adede, you've been in the legal industry for a bit. What is the best way of dealing with this? Because this information is beneficial to everybody else, but we seem to be having a bit of a challenge. accessing it?
Trevor, when you talk about the deadline was issued and the deadline has passed, the sense that a lot of people who own companies get is that they are not being followed, so they are okay. But you see, ignorance of the law is no defense. The law came into force from 21st of February 2020 for all companies limited by shares, so private limited companies, public limited companies, and companies limited by guarantee. The duty to prepare the register lies with the directors of those companies. Then in October of 2020, the registrar promoted the e-register for private companies to the e-citizen platform, which means private companies can now prepare the register and then proceed to file it. But public companies are required to prepare the register. It's only that they can't proceed to file it. Similar to companies limited by guarantee. They are required to prepare their register of beneficial owners, keep it until the registrar has an e-register, then they proceed to file it. So the advice that we can give to those who are listening, who have companies but have not started the process, is that the requirements of the law are clear. And if someone owns a company and they don't understand the requirements of the law under which their company is registered, that's what we call ignorance. There are processes, there are stakeholder engagements with the registrar. We have resources in this country. You can access the Companies Act and read for yourself if you can. But if you cannot, we have advocates. There are company secretaries in this country who, depending on your financial capacity, you can access the service. So that you get to know exactly what you're required to do and do it for your company. It is sad to hear that someone has a company, they're being asked to bring an annual return by the Register of Companies, then they turn up with a tax return, which means they have no idea what they are doing with their company. And it is those people who have no idea of what a company is that their lack of knowledge is abused. Because if you talk, you gave the example of NYS. How can you register a company? Put that company into a situation where that company does business with the government, gets a lot of money, and then you take some of that cash, withdraw it in cash, and take to someone. You don't know the tax obligations that are on the company, your duties and responsibilities as a director of that company. You are completely exposing yourself to legal action. So in as much as we are talking about what has not happened, I think there's a lot of education that we need to give to our members of the public who actually own companies but have no idea what they are getting themselves into.
Okay. And Madam Kwech, there's this situation where parents may own a company, and we've seen this even in the graft situations, but their children are also part of it. In this case, should things go south, who should carry the burden?
What I would say, Trevor, is this. By the time you're subscribing to the memorandum of a company, more or less, be it that you're a child, you're bound by that subscription. Say that what Malachi has talked about, ignorance of the law is no defense, that's the position. By the time you're subscribing to a memorandum, you should know that there are certain obligations which are being placed upon yourself.
But as a registrar now, I know Kenyans tend to respond more to repercussions, because you've said only 30% have given this information. The deadline is passed. What are you putting on the table? You've talked about stakeholder, of course, engagement. But when the rubber finally meets the road, what are the options that you'll be left with? Is there a chance of delisting companies? What happens then? What the BO provisions does talk about, if you fail, so the obligation is this: you're required to prepare and you maintain at the registered office, and you're supposed to submit a copy with the Register of Companies. If you fail to do that, it creates an offense which is punishable by law, and the fines are well stipulated. So in a situation where there is non-compliance, then the options which are available is not
not delisting. The Act does not give the registrar that power to do that, but there is an offense which is created, and the options which are available is enforcement.
Yeah.
Yes.
Abrams, is this solution now just stakeholder engagement from the Transparency International perspective? Is this the only thing we should do now?
That is not the only solution. I think we have diverse and different ways to ensure that we engage the public and we make this public ownership something that is of practice in our country, perhaps. So for me, stakeholder engagement is key. But now the big question is, even if we engage these stakeholders and there is no implementation at the level of where it's supposed to be implemented, there is no sort of some kind of movement. We see some practical engagements and practical solutions at the top level. Then what's the need for us to engage the citizens or stakeholders at that level? So perhaps stakeholders will play a critical role, but again, the onus stops at the implementing authority, which is now the BRS for me. Yes.
Okay. Let me see some questions coming through here, quite a number of them. I think they're... Danson says, are there taxes a company should pay yearly? Madam Koech.
That would be a question for the taxman, but certainly there are obligations which are, when you register your company, depending on whatever it is that you're seeking to do, by the time you're getting your KRA PIN, then there are certain obligations which you would be expected to have to comply with.
Okay.
Yes.
The questions are coming through. Let's put them up and see what you're saying. Any of you can answer these questions. By the way, it's an open field because they send in questions without directing to any specific person. Ina Sanei says, are banks and other financial institutions required to demand for the BO information before opening accounts for a company? How does the registration of a company ensure that such institutions comply the BO laws so that crooks don't run companies behind the curtain? You want to give that a try, Adede?
Absolutely. Now, Mr. Misoi did mention about POCAMLA, which is proceeds of crime. The banks and financial institutions, when they ask for beneficial ownership information, they're not asking in the context of the Companies Act. They are asking because the Central Bank of Kenya has guidelines, and the POCAMLA Act requires that when you are doing financial transactions, you provide your beneficial ownership information. And this goes when you are opening the accounts and when you are doing significant financial transactions, you need to disclose this information. Now, the collecting of information by banks does not lead to that beneficial owner information you provided to the banks being entered in the public register, which the Register of Companies maintains. So the fact that you gave the information to the bank for your company does not mean you've complied with the requirements with the Registrar of Companies. So I think distinction needs to be made where one has given the information to one party, being the financial institution, but they are yet to provide the same information to the registrar.
Okay. Let's bring up the next question or comment. Kojando Dan says, I don't always understand this CR12, Certificate of Incorporation, and Registration Certificate.
Interesting question there.
Yeah.
So when you register your company, when you submit the information which is required, we give you a certificate. And that's what we call the Certificate of Incorporation. And the CR12, as it's commonly known, is a search. You do a search on a company. You're seeking to know whether, one, the company is registered, what's the name, what's the registration date, and who are the owners of this company, who are the directors. That's the information which is contained in the CR12. When you talk about a registration certificate, this is often used for purposes of entities which does not have legal personality. So that when you register a business name, we'll give you a certificate.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, let's bring up the next one. Frederick, is there such thing as a one-person company?
Yes, there is
sole
one
proprietorship.
person. Yes, there is. When you look at some of the reforms that were introduced by the New Companies Act of 2015, for purposes of simplifying processes, for purposes of even increasing, enabling people to be able to establish, it did away with the minimum requirement of having 2 people as director shareholders in a company. And currently, you can register a one-person company.
Okay.
So indeed, there is.
All right, let's bring up another one here, see what they're saying. Mike Shiloke says, can you put to light the various categories that can be merged and work under an umbrella company? That's a rather complex situation whereby companies merge into one. Is it possible? Madam Koech? Or maybe you should explain more what that question is about.
The question
all right?
is not very clear.
The question is not clear.
Let's clarify that question more. Let's see what else you're asking here. Charlo Woodrose, he says, any director found by the court of law to have embezzled companies' finances should not be allowed to be a director of any company. Strict measures should be put in place to deal with such directors. This is an interesting conversation. Let me hear what you're thinking, the Abrahams, on this. Is that
I think that's a very strong comment.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, it could be one of the solutions. We are not wishing that away because this is a very good thing that Kenyans are putting out there, that perhaps if we have this sort of direction coming through and having such kind of structure in place, if you embezzle companies' resources and perhaps you found to be culpable of that kind of act, then you're not allowed per se, perhaps to be part of a company, another company in the case. I think that is a very good suggestion. We can't wish that away.
Yeah, because even today, I'd like to hear your thoughts because...
This is not a suggestion, this is law.
Yeah.
Actually, that's...
It appears Charlo Woodrose here has read.
But is it really happening? Because it's only today that the NSSF sentencing happened and the judge was categorical that all those who've been fined and sentenced to jail should not hold office.
So only a court of law can bar one from being a director of a company. And where there is an existing court order barring you, that court order will say for how long.
Yeah.
So for the duration that you are barred from being a director, even to attempt to be appointed again is an illegality by and of itself.
Yeah.
So I think
but we rarely ever see it.
A lot of people have not come to terms that if you do an illegality against the company or for the company in your role as a director, then you are in a sense setting yourself for disqualification as a director.
Okay. But we rarely ever see it though, because the court then has to pronounce itself directly.
I think we've had some cases of people who have been stopped from being directors.
Yeah.
The problem is they will not go around announcing to everyone. So unless you have the particular case where someone was stopped, then you know that this is actually happening.
Okay. Let's see what else. Yes, madam.
Trevor, what I would say is, as Malachi has put, we do have few cases. However, at the registry, we do often have clients coming complaining about issues of embezzlement, issues of directors breaching some of the provisions that are there in the Act. What I would say the big gap that we have is people are not aware of provisions in the law. People are not aware and they are not, you do not know. So that ignorance in itself, you find that there are certain breaches being committed against you as a shareholder. You do not know what recourse is available for you in the law.
I mean, like you said, ignorance is no defense. So when the rubber meets the road, you're the one in the dock. Okay, let's see what else you're saying. Dam says, what rights does beneficial owner have? How long does it take for one to change director/shares?
So the question of what rights, what I would say is some of the rights that would exist, if you were to call it really a right. One is this information is kept confidential, and this information we would not give it out to members of the public. We'll only give it to competent authorities as defined under the BO regulations. And then the other question is, how long does it take for one to change directors or shares? We've automated our processes, and the reason for this automation is to bring in efficiency policy to bring in effectiveness. It would take you an average of 2 to 3 days for your transaction to be done. Of course, we do our due diligence to avoid situations where people are being, entities are being fraudulently changed. So we do our due diligence, and it would take that average period of 2 to 3 days.
Okay.
Yes.
Let's bring up the next question or comment. Maxwell Fundi says, I would want to understand better the ecosystem of social enterprises in Kenya. What law governs registration of social enterprises? What tax obligations does these social enterprises have? So this is what you're talking about earlier on in terms of foreign companies and trusts being part of it. But do we really have regulation that encompasses all this? No, or are there gaps? Yes,
I think when we talk about social enterprises, what people have in mind is charitable entities, organizations that work with the society, with communities to bring for welfare outcomes. In the context of our law, you can register these at several levels. But for purposes of the register of companies, these companies, for example, are registered as companies limited by guarantee. So you are not going to make a profit out of it. Any surplus you make or profit is plowed back into the business for purposes of the goals of that this company set out to meet within the social
discourse part.
Set up. Now, in terms of tax, if you can convince KRA that your activities are for social benefit, they can exempt you from paying income tax for the company. But that's something that is subject to an application to the Revenue Authority. Now, other classes of tax will depend on what actually the company does, whether it has employees, and several other considerations before you zero in on exactly what taxes you need to pay.
Okay. Let's bring up another one here, see what you're saying. Pizamingo says, Trevor, I'm trying to log into the BRS on the eCitizen app, but it's unfortunately dysfunctional. How are you addressing the challenges? And that's the unfortunate thing about being live on air, because they test it in real time when you're still here. Madam Kwech.
The last I checked, it was functioning very well.
Because you just mentioned that you increased the bandwidth as well.
Exactly, and I would say we've not really had much downtime. Yes.
Okay. Let's see what else is there. Dr. Goa says, what is the maximum number of companies one can register in Kenya, if there is? Is there a maximum, or can you belong to several companies at the same time?
There is no maximum.
All right, and so isn't that another challenge from the Transparency International perspective? Because so if I have, say, like 100 companies...
If you're doing a legit business in these companies, why not? But if there's some sort of secrecy behind it, legitimacy, and sort of perpetuating corruption using these companies, then that is where we need to now question, and we need to come in and say, we need now transparency in this. Why do you want to engage in these number of companies? But if they're legit, then BRS will tell you, you can go ahead to do the registration.
I'm asking this question because we know the way the system tends to work. One person has several companies, then he's the same person who bids for a particular job and gets it.
The way Malachi just said that we have this one person having so many companies, and then you bid 3 million for the other, and the other one is 10 million. Perhaps that is where now the legitimacy comes in. And that is the reason we're talking about the beneficial ownership disclosure.
Okay.
And you know what, Trevor? The compliance obligations which would be placed, if you have your 100 companies, certainly there are quite a number of compliance obligations under the Act which are placed on you. And in a situation you've talked about engaging in very many tenders, one of the key developments which is happening is beneficial information for anybody who is doing public tendering. This information would be made public, so that if it's the same person and you're tendering using your different outfits, unless you've submitted wrong information. The moment you do your bid in terms of the public tenders, we're able to unmask and find that it's one and the same person who is the beneficial owner in all these companies which have bid for one particular tender.
Okay. Francis Barek says, does BO also apply to business names or private limited companies?
So beneficial ownership only applies to companies. It does not apply to business names. You find that it's talking about legal persons. So it's only applicable to private companies. It's applicable to public and companies limited by guarantee. One of the other things that's currently happening is, Ms. Soy had talked about, the question to do with foreign companies and limited liability partnerships. Indeed, these are entities which have legal personalities, and already we've begun the process of legislative reform to ensure that the law also is applicable to foreign companies and limited liability partnerships. Oh. So the only entity type which is not, which BO obligations does not apply to is business names. And the reason is because you cannot distinguish your trade name and the person behind that particular trade name.
All right. We have to take a quick break here in the Monday Report Town Hall session. I see a lot of your questions. When we come back, I'll pose some of them to my panelists in just a bit. All right? See you shortly.